This is slide 35, which is covering deglutition, which is another name for swallowing. Swallowing can be initiated voluntarily or involuntarily, but it proceeds automatically once it is begun. And here, this is an illustration of the 4 different stages of, well, it's 3 stages of swallowing. I'm sorry. And the tongue helps to form the food into a bolus. So when you swallow food, it's now called a bolus. It's just a small mass of food. So what actually initiates the swallowing process is compressing that bolus of food against your hard palate. All right, the first phase of deglutition or swallowing is called the buccal phase. It begins with the compression of the bolus against the hard palate, and then it ends when the bolus passes through the oropharynx. All right, the pharyngeal phase begins as the bolus comes into contact with the posterior pharyngeal wall. So you can see where the bolus is here. It hasn't passed the epiglottis in the buccal phase, and then in the pharyngeal phase, it's actually passing the epiglottis, which is covering over the opening to your windpipe, and the bolus is passing from your throat into your esophagus. At the same time the epiglottis keeps the food from going into your windpipe, your soft palate is also keeping it from going up into your nose, especially if it's a drink. It's easier for drink to move in that direction. Okay, especially if you're talking or laughing, The esophageal phase begins as the contraction of the pharyngeal muscles forces the bolus through the entrance to the esophagus. So it basically begins at the beginning portion of the esophagus. So that's the esophageal phase. So the phases are, they're named for. Buccal phase is occurring in the oral cavity. That's when you're actually, the bolus is moving into your throat. Pharyngeal phase, the bolus is in your pharynx or throat. And esophageal phase, the bolus is in your esophagus. Nothing too complicated about that. The buccal phase is the voluntary phase. In the pharyngeal phase, this is just make sure you remember this is the phase where the epiglottis prevents food from going into your windpipe, and then the esophageal phase and the pharyngeal phase are both involuntary phases. Moving on to the stomach has 4 primary functions. One is the temporary storage of ingested food. 2 is the mechanical breakdown of ingested food by churning it, And then 3 is the chemical digestion by acids and enzymes of food, but it's primarily the component of food that gets chemically digested by the stomach is protein. Proteins are broken down because they are, remember when we learned, the chemistry chapter, which was chapter 2, we talked about how complex proteins were, how large they are. So the digestion of proteins, it takes, several steps, several enzymes and several steps, and it begins in the stomach. The stomach also produces intrinsic factor. Without intrinsic factor, you can't absorb vitamin B12. And so that's going to lead to anemia because vitamin B12 is involved in red blood cell production. Chyme is what we call food now that it has mixed with gastric secretions in the stomach. So we called it a bolus, and now that it's in the stomach, we call it chyme. And we're going to call it chyme all the way until it enters the large intestine. Chyme is highly acidic due to hydrochloric acid secreted by the stomach. And the food is partially digested. Okay, there are 4 regions of the stomach. I'm just going to briefly go over those. The cardia is where the esophagus connects, and that's why we call that lower esophageal sphincter the cardiac sphincter. Then you have a region that kind of goes up, superior to the cardia, is called the fundus. The larger area of the stomach is called the body, and then the pylorus connects the stomach to the small intestine, which is why we call the sphincter that squirts chyme into the small intestine, we call that the pyloric sphincter. The stomach does have folds on its inner surface called rugae, and when the stomach expands, it can actually hold up to 1.5 liters of food and liquid. The rugae flatten out. The wall of the stomach has a muscularis externa that not only has the circular and longitudinal muscles, smooth muscles, but also a third oblique smooth muscle layer that assists in the mixing and churning motions that go on in the stomach. And mesenteries, called the greater omentum and the lesser omentum, greater connects the stomach to the abdominal viscera, which are other abdominal organs, and the lesser omentum connects the stomach to the liver. So looking at figure 16-8, I find figure B, this illustration, to be a little bit hard to follow. But you still can. You just have to concentrate. You have to think about what you're looking at, because this is a sagittal section, and it's just hard to see, like your small intestine. You're really seeing a cross section or transverse section through those small intestines. So you just see like an opening, like you would any tube. So it's just a little bit harder to adjust to it and interpret it. But let's start with the stomach. The folding on the inside of the stomach are called rugae. When the stomach's empty, you have more of these. So here is the cardia, which is the region of the stomach that connects to the esophagus. Here is the fundus. This is the body of the stomach, the biggest portion, and then the pylorus connects to the duodenum of the small intestine. When we blow up a little section of rugae, we can see more folding, and in the mucosa you have gastric pits and gastric glands. And the gastric glands have the following cells. They have parietal cells, G cells, and chief cells. So the G cells produce a hormone called gastrin. The parietal cells produce the hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor, and the chief cells produce pepsin, which is an enzyme that breaks down proteins. Okay, and I think really if you look at picture B, you can just see so here's the liver. The lesser omentum is the mesentery that connects the stomach to the liver, and then the greater omentum, which is here and here, connects the stomach to, this is the transverse colon, which is part of the large intestine, but other visceral organs. And I think that's good. I think that's all you really need to see from this image. All right, the gastric wall, the wall of the stomach, is lined with simple columnar epithelial tissue and mucus cells that secrete an alkaline mucus. And alkaline means basic. So this mucus protects the stomach lining from the chemicals that the stomach secretes. The acid and the enzymes secreted by the stomach would actually digest the stomach tissue itself without this protection. The gastric pits contain mucus cells, and the gastric glands produce 1.5 liters per day of gastric juice. And those gastric glands, like we talked about, contain 3 types of cells. The parietal cells secrete intrinsic factor, which is required to absorb vitamin B12, as we talked about before, and also hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid has a couple of functions. It lowers the pH of the gastric juice to anywhere from 1.5 to 2, which is a very strong acid. So very low pH in the stomach. Just in comparison to the rest of the body, most body fluid pH is slightly basic, a little bit above 7. The other function of the hydrochloric acid is to kill microorganisms, and that low pH activates the enzyme pepsin so that it will begin the digestion of proteins. So that is the function primarily of hydrochloric acid. And then chief cells secrete pepsinogen, and it is converted to pepsin. So we can just, it's fine with me if you just learn. Chief cells produce pepsin, which is the enzyme that breaks down protein. It's a proteolytic enzyme, meaning it breaks down proteins into smaller peptides or chains of amino acids. And this is one of your quiz questions. Infants secrete renin, and which is different from renin. So renin is the kidney hormone, that functions in blood volume and blood pressure, renin-angiotensin system. But renin is going to help digest milk, and gastric lipase will help to digest also the fats in milk. Renin will help to digest the carbohydrates in milk, like the lactase. Okay, so regulation of gastric activity. So I told you that I would mention areas that I like to focus on. I like to ask about hormones and what they do. So you're going to have to know gastrin. You're going to have to know that gastrin is released by G cells of the stomach. Here, let me blow this up. You need to see it bigger. Let's start with the cephalic phase of digestion. These are all the phases of digestion. The cephalic means head. So the cephalic phase is actually initiated by the sight, smell, taste, or thought of food. And so the cephalic phase begins the digestive process even before you put the food in your mouth. It is controlled by secretions through by stimulation through the vagus nerve, which is our parasympathetic nerve, that will stimulate the submucosal plexus to begin producing mucus, and to begin the secretions of all of the cells, the chief cells, parietal cells, and G cells of the stomach. Now, the G cells produce gastrin. So gastrin is going to be the secretion of gastrin by the stomach is going to actually start when you see, smell, taste, or think of food. And just remember, chief cells secrete pepsin and intrinsic factor, which is not listed on here. Parietal cells, I said that wrong. I'm so sorry. Chief cells secrete pepsin, parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. I could tell you how I remember that, but I'm afraid it would make it harder, not easier for you. I'm one of those people that I remember things based on the first letter of the word, so I'm going to tell you anyway. I brought it up. So parietal cells starts with a P, right? So I always remember that parietal and pepsin both start with P, and unlike what you would think, parietal cells secrete everything except the enzyme that starts with P. So therefore, the chief cells secrete pepsinogen, and the parietal cells secrete all the non-P words, which is hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. I hope this helps somebody. But the G cells secrete gastrin. See, that's easy because G and gastrin starts with G. Let's move on to the gastric phase. There are notes on all of these phases, but I thought it would be nice to look at the illustrations of the phases while we talk about them. So the gastric phase begins when food arrives in the stomach. And it results in the churning of the stomach, so the mixing of food in the stomach, and secretions of mucus from the mucus cells, pepsinogen from the chief cells, and hydrochloric acid from the I don't know where that rest of those words go, but hydrochloric acid, of course, is secreted by the parietal cells. So gastrin, you can see hormonal stimulation. The gastrin increases the chief cells, pepsin, parietal cells, hydrochloric acid, and mixing ways of the stomach. You follow the green pathway, and that shows you what gastrin does. Then we have the intestinal phase, and there are a lot more hormones involved in that. So the intestinal phase begins when chyme enters the duodenum, or the beginning portion of the small intestine. And the function is to control the rate of gastric emptying. We don't want food to enter the small intestine until the small intestine is ready for that food. So here are the hormones involved in the intestinal phase: CCK, or cholecystokinin, and GIP, which is gastric inhibitory peptide. They are released, stimulated by the presence of lipids and carbohydrates in the duodenum. So what they do is this little symbol means they inhibit the chief cells, and they inhibit the parietal cells, and they inhibit peristalsis, which is opposite of the effects of gastrin. Secretin is actually released, the stimulus is decreased pH. So decreased pH causes the release of secretin, and has many of the same effects as CCK and GIP. And the notes are going to give us more specifics on the stages of the gastric stages.